Have you ever wondered how a simple gesture can change everything? Imagine being in a place as ordinary as a rest stop, where everyone seems to be minding their own business, yet something unusual catches your eye. What would you do if you noticed a silent call for help? Would you recognize it? Would you act on it? Today, we're diving into a story that's a bit unsettling, but one you won't forget. It's a story of an alert Marine, a young girl, and a silent SOS signal. What does it take for someone to pick up on signs others might miss? And why should we all learn to recognize these subtle signals that could save lives? In this video, you'll uncover the details of an encounter that seemed so ordinary on the surface, but turned into something truly heroic. We'll explore what happened when a simple gesture, almost invisible to most, was noticed by the right person at the right time. Stick around because, by the end, you'll not only know how one person's instincts led to a rescue, but you'll also learn the essential SOS signal that everyone should recognize. This isn't just about one moment. It's about the hidden signs we often overlook and the unexpected heroes who act on instinct. Are you ready to see how something so small can become so powerful? Let's dive in. It was just an ordinary day at a rest stop. The kind of place people don't give a second thought to. Travelers come and go, families stretch their legs, and tired drivers grab a quick snack before hitting the road again. It's a place of movement, a point between two destinations where everyone's a stranger to one another. But that's precisely what makes this story so unusual. In this sea of strangers, among the hustle of travelers, sat a young black girl and her white father. They looked like any other pair, tired, maybe a little travel-worn, waiting patiently as if on a routine journey. At a quick glance, nothing about them would seem out of place, but sometimes it's that very sense of normalcy that can hide a bigger story. As the minutes ticked by, people around them remained oblivious to their presence. No one stopped to look twice, and no one felt any need to question the calm scene in front of them. After all, what's suspicious about a father and daughter at a rest stop, right? But amidst the crowd, there was one person whose instincts were sharper than most. A Marine, just passing through, noticed the pair. He had only planned to make a brief stop, maybe to stretch or grab a drink, but as his eyes fell upon the young girl, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The girl's eyes darted around, glancing at people passing by as if searching for someone or something. Her body was tense, rigid, as if her movements were restricted. Her father, however, seemed entirely at ease. He checked his phone, sipped from his coffee, and didn't appear to notice his daughter's distress. But the Marine's training had taught him to trust his instincts. He knew that in many situations, it's often the smallest, most overlooked details that can mean the difference between safety and danger. And then it happened. The girl lifted her hand, subtly, almost as if by accident. She made a quick, careful movement that could have easily been mistaken for a simple stretch or scratch. But for those who knew what to look for, it was clear. She was making a silent, universally recognized signal, an SOS that many wouldn't even recognize. But the Marine did. The symbol was one he had been trained to notice, one that meant only one thing: help. In that moment, the calm and ordinary scene at the rest stop shifted, even if no one else noticed. The Marine's heart began to race as he weighed his options. His years of training had prepared him for high-stakes situations, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. Here he was, in a crowded but casual public space, trying to determine if a young girl was in danger, or if his mind was simply playing tricks on him. He scanned the rest stop again, but everything seemed perfectly normal. Families walked past, laughing and chatting. Travelers busied themselves with snacks and coffee, completely unaware of the silent drama unfolding right in front of them. But that brief gesture, that simple hand movement, had set something off within him. The Marine had seen that sign once before, in a training exercise that emphasized spotting subtle cries for help. And now, he was seeing it in real life, not in a scenario, but right in front of him. Still, the Marine questioned himself. Was he really seeing what he thought he was seeing? Could it just be his imagination, maybe a misinterpretation of an innocent action? But as he looked at the girl's face, he saw something unmistakable. Fear. It was buried deep, well hidden beneath a composed expression. But for someone with trained eyes, it was there. A mix of uncertainty and determination began to flood his mind. He knew he couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at him. His entire career had been about protecting others, and every instinct he had was telling him that something wasn't right. He had two options: ignore it, brush it off as a misunderstanding, or take a step that could potentially save a life. He took a breath, deciding he was willing to risk the latter. The Marine knew he had to be discreet. One wrong move could make things worse. He kept his eyes on the father and daughter, carefully observing their interactions, searching for any more clues. The father was still relaxed, too relaxed, unaware that his supposed calmness was only raising more questions. The rest stop continued to buzz with activity as the Marine's mind raced. He knew he couldn't just walk up and question the father without a clear plan, but he also couldn't simply leave without investigating. The world around him moved in slow motion as he tried to figure out his next step. This was no drill. This was real life, with real people, real risks, and real consequences. The Marine had seen a lot in his life, but nothing could have prepared him for this quiet, unassuming moment at a simple rest stop. As he stood there, torn between his duty to help and the risk of overstepping, a battle raged inside him. Should he trust his instincts, or was he misreading the situation? This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes felt just as high. He could still see the young girl's face in his mind, her slight, almost invisible SOS signal imprinted in his thoughts. Her subtle plea for help wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet, restrained, and easy to miss, and that was what haunted him the most. In his years of training, he'd been taught to look for signs, to spot danger where others might see nothing. But this wasn't a war zone, and the idea of approaching someone based on a hunch made his stomach tighten with uncertainty. But there was something in her eyes, a look of trapped fear, that he couldn't shake. As the minutes ticked by, he started to weigh his options. He knew he couldn't just walk up to the father, accuse him outright, or make a scene. That could escalate things in a way he wasn't prepared to handle. What if he was wrong? What if he had just misinterpreted an innocent interaction? The last thing he wanted was to cause harm by being overzealous, but his instincts kept pushing him, a constant reminder of his duty to protect others. To the people around him, the Marine might have looked calm, but inside, he was in full crisis mode. Every time he tried to convince himself to let it go, he would look back at the girl. Her body language was subtle but telling. She kept glancing at other people, her movements small and restrained, as if she was afraid of drawing attention. The father, on the other hand, didn't seem aware of her behavior at all. He kept a casual, almost dismissive attitude, completely at ease in the bustling rest stop environment. The Marine's mind was racing, and with each second, he grew more certain that he needed to act. But the question remained: how? How could he step in without making a scene, without putting the girl at more risk? His training had prepared him for dangerous encounters, but nothing about this situation felt straightforward. He felt like he was stepping onto a tightrope, where one wrong move could send everything spiraling. He decided to try something simple, something subtle. He approached the father and daughter, pretending to be just another friendly passerby. With a polite smile, he greeted them, keeping his tone light and casual. "Long day of traveling, huh?" he said, aiming his question at the father. The man looked up, surprised but friendly, and responded with an easy nod. "Yeah, just on a little road trip," he replied. There was nothing particularly strange about his answer, but the Marine noticed that the girl didn't look up. She stayed quiet, her eyes focused on the ground, almost as if she was trying to be invisible. The Marine felt his heart rate quicken. Something was off, and he was becoming more convinced of it with each passing second. He took a deep breath, maintaining his calm, and continued talking, aiming another question at the father. But this time, he kept his eyes on the girl, watching for any reaction, any small sign. The father answered the question, but as he did, the girl shifted slightly. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, but there was a stiffness to her that was impossible to ignore. Her body seemed tense, her shoulders tight, and her eyes looked past him, as if trying to avoid his gaze. The Marine knew this wasn't enough to take any direct action, but his instincts told him there was more going on. He took a different approach, subtly turning his attention to the girl. With a warm, gentle tone, he addressed her directly. "You doing okay?" he asked softly, hoping his calm approach might ease her discomfort. The girl looked up, and for the first time, their eyes met. In that brief moment, he saw a flash of something he couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or desperation. Her gaze was fleeting, but in those few seconds, it was enough to confirm his suspicions. She quickly looked back down, her face expressionless, but her silence spoke louder than any words could. The father seemed unfazed by the Marine's attention on his daughter, almost as if he didn't consider her reaction important. The Marine took this as another small clue, one that added to his growing suspicion. A true parent might show some level of protectiveness, a sense of connection, but this man seemed oddly detached. The Marine's mind raced, piecing together these subtle signs like fragments of a puzzle. Nothing was blatant, nothing was certain, but everything pointed to one conclusion. The girl needed help. He felt a surge of responsibility weighing on him, knowing that he might be her only chance at safety. But he also knew he had to be careful. If he made a wrong move, it could make things worse. So he did what any trained professional would do. He decided to get a bit closer without alerting the father to his intentions. As he moved, he kept his demeanor casual, blending in with the crowd. He glanced around, looking for any potential support, anyone who could assist if the situation escalated. His mind was working overtime, assessing all possible outcomes, calculating risks. He could feel his training kicking in, guiding him through each step, helping him navigate this delicate encounter. Then, without missing a beat, he saw his opportunity. The father was momentarily distracted, checking his phone, which gave the Marine the perfect moment to act. He leaned in closer to the girl, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you need help," he murmured softly, "just give me a sign." The girl didn't respond verbally, but she nodded ever so slightly, a movement so small it was barely noticeable. But to the Marine, it was everything. That tiny nod was all he needed to confirm his suspicions. His heart pounded, but he kept his expression steady, determined not to alert the father. At that moment, he knew he had to act fast, but he couldn't risk alarming the girl's father. With his training kicking into high gear, he made a quick decision. He pretended to leave, giving the girl and her father one last polite nod. But as he walked away, he discreetly pulled out his phone, dialing for assistance, his voice calm but firm. As the Marine waited for backup, his pulse quickened. Time felt like it was moving in slow motion, each second stretching on as he kept a discreet eye on the girl and her father. He'd done what he could without causing a scene, but now he was faced with the hardest part, waiting. He knew that in situations like these, things could go south in an instant, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down, even for a moment. Every fiber in his being was tuned to the two of them, watching for any subtle change in behavior, any sign that he needed to step in. The father seemed unaware of the Marine's lingering gaze, still preoccupied with his phone. But the girl's posture remained tense. She hadn't relaxed for a second, her body language rigid, almost frozen. To everyone else, she probably looked like any other tired kid on a road trip, but to the Marine, her silence spoke volumes. It was as if she was trying to disappear, to become invisible. She didn't look around, or take in the busy rest stop like most people would. Instead, she kept her gaze down, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make herself as small as possible. The Marine's mind raced through his options. He knew backup was on the way, but he had no idea how long it would take them to arrive. Should he approach them again? What if the father caught on? He had to walk a fine line between gathering information and not tipping the man off. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, but a familiar tension was building up in his chest, the same feeling he'd had countless times before on dangerous missions. Only this time, there were no weapons, no uniforms, no battle cries, just a simple rest stop, a father and a daughter. Suddenly, the father seemed to notice the Marine's presence. He looked up, his eyes locking onto him for a brief, unsettling moment. There was no aggression in his gaze, no open hostility, but something about the way he looked at the Marine made his skin crawl. It was as if he'd been caught, as if the father knew he was watching. The Marine quickly averted his gaze, pretending to be interested in something else, hoping the man would believe he was just another passerby. But that look had sent a chill down his spine. Was he on to him? Did he know? The Marine's mind was spinning with questions, each one adding to his growing sense of urgency. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that he was running out of time. He could feel it in his bones, an instinct honed from years of training, an unexplainable sense that danger was lurking just below the surface. In a moment of calm determination, the Marine made a decision. He couldn't just stand there any longer. Slowly, he walked toward a nearby vending machine, positioning himself close enough to keep an eye on them, but far enough to avoid suspicion. As he fumbled for change, he watched them out of the corner of his eye. The father seemed oblivious, but the girl glanced up, catching sight of the Marine. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he saw something that shook him to his core, a flicker of fear, quickly masked, but unmistakable. That look was all he needed to confirm his suspicions. There was no way he could ignore it now. This wasn't just his gut. This was real. He knew, without a doubt, that the girl was in trouble, that she needed help. But how could he help her without making things worse? His training had taught him to be strategic, to think several steps ahead, and he knew that any rash move could put her at risk. But standing there, waiting for backup, felt like torture. Then, just as he was wrestling with his options, something unexpected happened. The father abruptly stood up, motioning for the girl to follow him. The Marine's heart skipped a beat. Where were they going? Was he planning to leave before help could arrive? He couldn't let them slip away. Not now. Not when he was so close. The Marine watched as they walked toward the rest stop's exit. His mind raced, running through scenarios, calculating the risks. He couldn't afford to let them leave, but he couldn't just walk up to them and intervene, not without knowing for sure. He felt his pulse quicken, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his system as he realized what he had to do. Without drawing attention, he started to follow them, keeping a safe distance but close enough to act if necessary. Each step felt like a gamble, a delicate balance between caution and urgency. He didn't know where they were headed, but he was prepared to follow them as far as he had to. His senses were on high alert. Every movement, every sound, every detail burned into his mind as he shadowed them through the crowded rest stop. The father didn't seem to notice, his attention focused on the exit, but the girl glanced back, her eyes widening when she saw the Marine following them. For a split second, he thought she might say something, might cry out for help. But she didn't. She just looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and hope, as if silently pleading for him to do something, to save her from whatever nightmare she was trapped in. As they reached the door, the Marine felt his resolve harden. He couldn't let her leave without trying something, anything, to get her to safety. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he let her slip away. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with possible outcomes, each one more uncertain than the last. But he knew one thing for sure, he was going to do whatever it took to protect her. Just then, he spotted a security guard standing nearby, casually chatting with another rest stop visitor. It was his chance. Without hesitation, he approached the guard. his voice low but urgent. He explained the situation as quickly and calmly as he could, his words measured but filled with the quiet urgency of someone who knew time was running out. The guard listened, his expression turning serious as the Marine laid out his suspicions. He nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, and agreed to keep an eye on the pair as they exited. The Marine watched as the guard discreetly followed them, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. He knew he'd done everything he could, but the outcome was still out of his hands. He could only hope that the guard would step in at the right moment. That help would arrive before it was too late. As the father and daughter moved closer to their car, the tension became almost unbearable. The Marine felt his pulse in his ears, his breath shallow as he waited for some sign, some confirmation that his actions had made a difference. He knew he might never know what happened after this, but he held on to the hope that the girl would be safe, that she would find the courage to reach out, to trust that someone was watching over her. The Marine watched as the security guard walked toward the father and daughter, calm but purposeful. He could feel his heart pounding, each beat a reminder of how close they were to either finding help or losing the chance altogether. He wasn't sure what the security guard would do or if the man would sense the growing scrutiny, but the Marine knew that this was the critical moment. Would the girl be able to give any more hints to confirm her silent plea for help, or would she fall silent in fear? Standing at a safe distance, the Marine kept his eyes trained on them. The father seemed at ease, perhaps assuming they were just another family on the road. His body language was relaxed, too casual, but that, to the Marine, seemed out of place. In situations where everything seemed normal, there was always something that stood out if you looked hard enough. And the Marine had been trained to notice these details, to watch for the cracks beneath the surface. The guard approached the man politely, initiating a conversation as if it were a routine check. For a moment, the father seemed slightly thrown off guard, but he quickly regained his composure. He responded calmly, keeping a steady, pleasant tone. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about his demeanor, but the Marine sensed a hidden tension in the way the man answered, an underlying rigidity, a flicker of controlled agitation. The girl, on the other hand, kept her gaze down, silent and still, as though retreating into herself. The guard continued his questions, and as the conversation went on, the Marine could feel a rising sense of unease. If the man felt cornered, would he lash out? Would he try to escape? The stakes felt impossibly high, and the Marine knew that one wrong move could set off a dangerous chain of events. But he also knew they couldn't just walk away, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. At one point, the guard asked to see some identification. The father hesitated, just for a split second, but it was enough for the Marine to notice. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The man pulled out his wallet, fumbling slightly as he searched for his ID. There was a slight shake in his hands, a tremor that betrayed his outward calm. The Marine held his breath, feeling the tension in the air as if it were a physical weight pressing down on him. He watched the man's every move, trying to anticipate his next action. And then, just as the guard examined the ID, the father made a subtle but telling gesture. He moved a step closer to the girl, placing his hand protectively on her shoulder. The Marine couldn't help but notice how her body tensed under his touch, as if recoiling from an unspoken threat. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but to the Marine, it spoke volumes. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way her body language screamed for help, even though her lips remained tightly sealed. At that moment, the Marine knew they had enough to go on. He signaled subtly to another officer nearby, a quiet nod that communicated the need for immediate action. The officer moved in with careful steps, ready to provide support if the situation escalated. They couldn't afford to let this slip. They couldn't let the girl walk away without knowing the truth. As the tension grew, the father glanced around, his gaze momentarily sweeping over the Marine and the other officers. He must have sensed the tightening circle, the inescapable scrutiny surrounding him. For a fleeting moment, his mask slipped, and there was a flash of something dark and defensive in his eyes. The Marine braced himself, ready to act if necessary, but then, unexpectedly, the father backed down. Perhaps he realized he was outnumbered or felt the pressure of so many eyes watching him closely. Whatever his reason, he seemed to decide against making the scene. Slowly, almost as if resigning himself to the inevitable, the father released his hold on the girl's shoulder. The Marine felt a flicker of relief, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There was still so much they didn't know, so many unanswered questions. But for now, the girl was safe, no longer in the grip of someone who might harm her. As the officers escorted the man away for further questioning, the girl stood frozen in place, as though she couldn't quite process what was happening. The Marine approached her gently, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. He could see the fear and confusion in her eyes, the lingering doubt that everything was truly over. But as he spoke, offering her words of comfort and support, he saw a gradual shift. The tension in her shoulders eased, her eyes softened, and for the first time, she looked directly at him, her gaze filled with gratitude and relief. The Marine felt a wave of emotion, a deep sense of responsibility and empathy for this young girl who had endured so much. He'd been trained for situations like these, had faced danger countless times. But this was different. This wasn't just about following protocol or fulfilling a duty. This was about making a real difference in someone's life, about giving hope to someone who had been trapped in fear and silence. And as he stood there, watching her regain a sense of safety, he realized that his instincts, his unwavering dedication to doing what was right, had led them both to this moment. It was a reminder of the power of vigilance, of the importance of looking out for others, even when it seemed like none of your business. The Marine knew the investigation was far from over. There would be questions, statements to give, and a long process to ensure the girl was truly safe. But for now, in this moment, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had done what he could, and because of that, a young life had been spared from an uncertain fate. As the father was taken aside for questioning, the atmosphere shifted. The little girl remained where she was, her small frame almost lost in the vastness of the rest stop. The Marine stayed close, aware that her safety was still fragile. Though the immediate danger seemed to have been averted, the uncertainty of what would happen next loomed like dark clouds ready to unleash a storm. He could see the mix of confusion and fear on her face, and his heart ached for her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, kneeling down to her level. She nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted around, searching for her father, looking for some semblance of comfort in the chaos. The Marine noticed how she hugged her backpack tightly to her chest, as if it were a shield against the world. He needed to gain her trust, to reassure her that she was safe now. "I'm here to help you," he said, trying to project warmth and calmness. "You're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Do you want to tell me what happened?" For a moment, it seemed like the words were stuck in her throat, heavy and unyielding. She took a deep breath, her small shoulders rising and falling. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was scared. He told me to be quiet." The Marine's heart sank at her admission. The girl's trembling hands reflected her inner turmoil. He knew that sometimes, in the face of fear, silence became a refuge. But he also understood that sharing her story was a vital step toward healing. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "It's okay. You can tell me anything. I promise, I'm here to protect you." She looked at him, her wide eyes searching his face for sincerity. It was a crucial moment. She needed to feel that he was genuinely there for her, not just as an officer, but as a human being who understood her fear. "My dad and I were just on a trip," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We were driving, and then we stopped here. He said we were taking a break, but I wanted to go home. I told him I was scared, but he said I had to be quiet. He said no one could know." The Marine's stomach twisted with a mix of anger and sorrow. It became clear that her father was not the safe figure she needed him to be. The girl's father had crossed a line that should never be breached between parent and child. As she continued to speak, the Marine listened intently, his instincts urging him to validate her feelings while keeping the tension of the situation at bay. "What did you mean when you signaled for help?" he asked gently, guiding her back to the moment that led to their intervention. She swallowed hard, her expression shifting as the memory surfaced. "I saw you," she said, pointing to where the Marine had been standing. "I thought you could help me. So I made the sign like they do in the movies. I didn't know if you would see me, but I was scared to say anything." The weight of her words hung in the air. It struck him how a simple gesture, a flicker of hope, had created a ripple effect that had the power to change everything. She had been brave, even in her silence, and now she was learning that courage came in many forms. He felt a surge of pride for her, but also an overwhelming responsibility to ensure she understood the power she held. "You did really well," he assured her. "What you did took a lot of courage. You saw something was wrong, and you found a way to get help. That's important." As she nodded, the faintest hint of a smile broke through the storm of fear in her eyes. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Marine watched as a flicker of confidence began to grow within her. He understood that these moments, small as they may seem, could plant the seeds of resilience in her young heart. Just then, a commotion behind them drew their attention. The father was still being questioned, but his demeanor was shifting. He was raising his voice, a mixture of frustration and anger as he demanded to know why he was being held. The tension in the air thickened again, and the Marine felt a shift in his gut. The situation was far from over, and the safety of the girl still hung in the balance. The Marine turned back to the girl, seeing her uncertainty return. "Remember, you are safe now. We're going to figure this out together." Her gaze followed his, wide with concern as she watched her father's rising agitation. He could feel her apprehension as she clung tighter to her backpack. The Marine knew that this was another moment of choice for her. Would she retreat into fear, or would she find the strength to stand up against what she had endured? Suddenly, the father made a move, his voice booming louder, demanding answers. "You have no right to stop me. This is my daughter." The words sliced through the air, filled with a desperate kind of rage that was unsettling. The Marine's protective instincts kicked in again, and he shifted his body slightly, placing himself as a barrier between the girl and the scene unfolding behind them. "Stay close to me," he instructed firmly, ready to take action if necessary. He could feel the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, but he couldn't afford to let fear creep into the girl's heart once more. She needed stability, reassurance, and above all, safety. The situation had escalated rapidly. The Marine's mind raced with the potential outcomes. Would the father try to escape? Would he become violent? The uncertainty was palpable, yet amidst the chaos, the Marine's resolve only strengthened. They had to protect the girl, not just physically but emotionally. The courage she had shown already needed to be met with unwavering support, and he was determined to provide that.